Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating and frankly terrifying 20-year domino effect. We're going to look at exactly how the world went from the so-called war to end all wars straight into an even deadlier global conflict. It is an incredible look at just how fragile global stability actually is. We're focusing on the years 1919 to 1939. It's this remarkably brief window where the world tried to rebuild through a massive debt-fueled party, suffered a total economic collapse, and ultimately just watched the whole international order tear itself apart.
So, here is our roadmap for exploring these two turbulent decades. First, a flawed peace. Second, global economic collapse. Third, rise of the dictators. Fourth, the failure of diplomacy. And finally, the final spark.
You know, there is this perfect, tragic symmetry to this era. Look at this. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is signed, which was supposedly going to secure peace forever. Exactly 10 years later, in 1929, the Wall Street crash completely shatters the global economy. And then, exactly 10 years after that, in 1939, Germany invades Poland. 20 years. That's literally all it took to go from a treaty meant to ensure permanent peace to the outbreak of the most destructive war in human history. So, let's find out why.
Section 1. A flawed peace. The foundations of resentment.
It really starts with the fact that the severe penalties of the Treaty of Versailles fostered deep, lasting resentment. The Allied powers wanted to punish Germany, right? They wanted to ensure it can never be a threat again. So, they forced Germany to accept total responsibility for the war. That's the infamous war guilt clause. They demanded these absolutely staggering financial reparations, slashed the German military to just a fraction of its former size, and carved away huge chunks of their territory. For the German people, this wasn't a negotiation at all. It was a humiliating, dictated peace. And that created a deeply bitter environment, basically laying the perfect foundation of national grievance that extremist politicians would later expertly exploit.
And wow, did the immense economic strain from those reparations crack that fragile post-war foundation fast. By 1923, Germany actually fell behind on its payments. This led French and Belgian troops to literally occupy Germany's industrial heartland. So what was the German government's response? Well, they simply printed massive amounts of money to pay their striking workers. And this triggered catastrophic hyperinflation. It completely untethered the currency from reality and destroyed whatever public confidence was left in Germany's new democratic Weimar Republic.
Just try to picture the striking human scale of this crisis for a second. Imagine the shocking reality of needing a literal wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. Prices weren't just rising, they were doubling every few days. People's life savings, the money they had worked decades and decades to save, became literally worthless overnight. Workers were having to be paid multiple times a day just so they could rush to the store before their wages lost their value. I mean, this level of economic chaos breeds profound desperation, and desperate people, they start looking for radical solutions.
Which brings us to Section 2, Global Economic Collapse. The illusion shatters.
So the 1920s kind of offered this deceptive, short-lived optimism. Thanks to American loans, specifically the Dawes Plan, European economies stabilized for a bit. We got the Roaring '20s, jazz, cinema, booming consumer culture, and genuine diplomatic optimism. But it was basically a house of cards. The 1929 Wall Street crash triggered a massive global panic because all these international economies were so deeply interconnected. The American loans stopped, banks failed, unemployment skyrocketed globally, and international trade just completely collapsed. That brief illusion of stability was utterly shattered.
Section 3. Rise of the dictators. The appeal of extremism.
When millions are facing absolute economic misery and democratic governments look completely incapable of fixing it, people turn to strongmen. And when we look closely at these four totalitarian regimes, a really dark parallel emerges. They all violently rejected liberal democracy. In Italy, Mussolini built the first fascist state on extreme nationalism and militarism. In Germany, Hitler's Nazi party weaponized the resentment of Versailles and the misery of the Depression, pushing horrific theories of racial superiority, anti-Semitism, and demanding Lebensraum, or living space. Over in Japan, military leaders seized control, pushing for aggressive territorial expansion across Asia for resources. And in the Soviet Union, Stalin forced ruthless centralized planning, brutal agricultural collectivization, and massive political purges. Their specific ideologies varied, sure, but their methods were identical. Absolute centralized control, zero political opposition, and intense militarization.
Section 4, The Failure of Diplomacy. The Collapse of Collective Security.
With these aggressive regimes rapidly gaining power, the fragile international system was put to the ultimate test. And unfortunately, the League of Nations, the very organization built to prevent another world war, was structurally incapable of enforcing collective security. It's actually a shocking list of weaknesses. The United States, even though their own president championed the League, never even joined it. The League had no independent military force to back up its rules. Any major decision required every single member to agree, which, let's be honest, is practically impossible in geopolitics. So, when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, or when Italy conquered Ethiopia in 1935, all the League could do is issue weak economic sanctions that these aggressive nations just completely ignored.
And this brings us to a really pivotal question. When these powerful nations started boldly, openly breaking the rules, why on earth didn't the world intervene? If Hitler was blatantly violating the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilding his military, and demanding territory, why did Britain and France just stand by and watch?
Well, the answer lies in the policy of appeasement. It was a desperate strategy, but we have to remember it was born from profound trauma. The horrors of the First World War were incredibly fresh in the minds of British and French leaders. Entire generations of young men had been wiped out just 2 decades prior. Combine that trauma with the crushing economic realities of the Great Depression, and there was absolutely zero public appetite for another war. So their logic was, maybe if we just give Hitler what he wants, maybe if we just address his legitimate grievances, he'll stop and we can preserve the peace. But its history brutally demonstrated giving an inch to an expansionist dictator only guarantees they are going to take a mile.
Section 5, the final spark, the march to World War II.
Let's look at this final sequence, because it really builds into this unstoppable momentum. Hitler systematically expanded his territory, basically testing the boundaries of appeasement at every single step. Step 1, he marches troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. Britain and France do nothing. Step 2, 2 years later, he annexes Austria entirely. Again, minimal pushback. Step 3, later that year at the infamous Munich Agreement, Britain and France literally hand him the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a pinky promise that he won't ask for anything else. But then comes step 4. In 1939, Hitler occupies the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. This was the breaking point. It proved unequivocally that Hitler wasn't just trying to unite German-speaking peoples, he wanted continental domination. Diplomacy had officially failed.
Now, facing the reality that Britain and France might actually fight back, Hitler needed to make sure he wouldn't face a two-front war. Enter the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939. This was a total shocker, a non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. These guys were bitter ideological enemies, but the crucial part was a secret provision. They quietly agreed to carve up Eastern Europe into their own spheres of influence. With the threat of Soviet intervention neutralized, the final diplomatic obstacle for German military action was totally cleared.
And then, bam, on September 1st, 1939, the peace was shattered entirely. German forces poured across the Polish border, using highly coordinated, lightning-fast blitzkrieg tactics. Britain and France finally woke up and recognized that appeasement was a catastrophic failure. 2 days later, they honored their alliances and declared war on Germany. The interwar period was officially over.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with this really haunting paradox. How did a desperate global desire for lasting peace paradoxically pave the way for an even more destructive world war? The world in 1919 wanted nothing more than to avoid another conflict. Yet, an overly punitive peace treaty, unaddressed economic devastation, the allure of authoritarian strongmen, and an international system just too weak to enforce its own rules created a deadly domino effect. The desperate desire to avoid conflict at all costs is exactly what empowered those who wanted to create it. And I think that is an incredibly powerful lesson about the fragility of global cooperation that absolutely still matters for us today. What do you think? Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.